Can you all hear me okay? Good. Wonderful. Okay, so good evening, and yes, welcome to Leighton House. Um, I am going to begin by giving a little bit of background information about Frederic Leighton, um, and then we will embark on this virtual exploration of his great legacy of the house itself. Um, so Frederic Leighton was born in 1830 in Scarborough, and from there he went to University College School in London for a time before the family relocated to Frankfurt. And this was where he completed his education and where he went to art school. And obviously, from there, he started to travel extensively, initially just within Europe, but from the 1850s into North Africa and the Middle East. And so, obviously, during this time, he was becoming this very cultured, accomplished individual who would go on to become the president of the Royal Academy in 1878. And he spoke 5 languages, and he was obviously just absorbing all these extraordinary influences, aesthetic influences, was the key aspect, around him. But also he met obviously many significant individuals, and amongst those were, or at least the ones who were most relevant to this house, were Eugene Delacroix, the French Romanticist artist, who it's known that he visited his studio house in Paris whilst he was living in Paris. And we think that's where he may have got this idea of the studio house that we will see here today. But probably perhaps even more importantly was that he met the future architect of this house, George Aitchison, whilst he was living in Rome. And he lived in Rome for 3 years during the 1850s. And this was an interesting relationship because Leighton could have chosen one of the fashionable architects of the day, such as Philip Webb, who designed William Morris's Red House. But instead he chose Aitchison specifically because he didn't really have any previous experience in domestic projects. Aitchison came from a sort of a line of industrial architects, so they mainly dealt in wharves and warehouses and the like. And this was exactly what Leighton wanted, because Leighton didn't really want anyone meddling in the artistic aspect of the design, because obviously he had such specific ideas. So he really wanted it to be a collaborative effort. And this was the perfect partnership. Plus, they were just very good friends. They travelled extensively in Italy together, and he knew that he could trust him and that they would work well together. So Leighton eventually moves back to London in 1859 and lives for a time at Orme Square in Bayswater. And then in 1864, he commissions the house. And so the first phase of building happens between 1864 and 1866, roughly. But there are 3 to 4 further phases of sort of edits and building and construction right through to his death in 1896. So it's a permanent kind of work in progress throughout his life. And there are a few things that I just like to sort of observe, or for us to contemplate as we go around the house, which is that primarily the primary reason for this house being built was as a working and studio space, or an exhibition and studio space. The domestic aspect is very secondary, as we'll see. And sort of following on from that, whilst he was clearly a fantastic painter and sculptor in his own right, to my mind, it was really his role as a sort of great curator that was so significant, because he brings together all these fantastically eclectic influences, or his passions, whether it was his love of Venetian art, his interest in Middle Eastern ceramics, his own styles of his sort of mid-style of neoclassicism evolving into aestheticism in painting. Aspects of pre-raphaelites, components of the arts and crafts movement, all of these come together in this extraordinary hybrid that he curates effectively. And then lastly, just I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that after his death in 1896, the house was left to his 2 sisters, Alexandra and Augusta. And it wasn't really an ideal space for these 2 ladies to be living alone. It was more of a 19th century bachelor pad, if you like, with just the 1 bedroom. So after an initial attempt to sell the house with its contents, they ended up stripping the contents and selling them at Christie's over a sort of 9-day sale. in 1896. And whilst this might initially have seemed a tragedy, ironically, I think that it's what sort of kept the essence of the place alive. Because if you go to the house today, everything you see there are either pieces that have been traced and brought back to the house and sit in their original spots, including many of his oil paintings, or pieces that have been inspired by the house, by contemporary artists, or replicas of original pieces that have a sort of modern or contemporary interpretation on them. So that, alongside the kind of the constant stream of exhibitions and concerts that the house hosts, keeps the place as a sort of cultural hub in exactly the way that I think he would have wanted and loved had he still been alive today. So I think, you know, his legacy continues in that sense. So just to show you a sort of quick exterior view of the house, it's really a Victorian take, I suppose, on a sort of Florentine palazzo, I think was loosely the theme. But for me, its main role is that it's very, it reveals nothing of the kind of explosion of color and decoration and excitement that you encounter when you go into the house. So it serves this role beautifully of being very kind of modest and unassuming in a sense, compared to its interior. And then I'm just going to show us quickly this, because it's quite useful, this this plan, as it shows how the house kind of evolved over the years. So this kind of pale orange peachy colour indicates obviously the initial build on the ground floor and up on the first floor. And then we see how, and that was in 1864 to 66. And then this second phase of building with the Arab Hall and the library, around 1878 to 79, and then the Winter Studio in 1879, and the Silk Room around 1894, so really just very shortly before he died. And we're going to start in the dining room, which is obviously just here. So Leighton was obviously a very important part of late Victorian society, not just because of his role at the RA, but obviously that helped establish him, particularly because he hadn't really lived in London. When he moved back in 1859, he hadn't lived there since he was a child. So, you know, but he was obviously very well connected, and he hosted many parties alongside all his concerts and exhibitions. And this we can see here, this is his table, not the tablecloth was not the original, but the table beneath it is. And it extended out to accommodate up to 25 people. So he could have a decent sized dinner party here. And allegedly he always sat in the same seat, and that the chair was slightly raised, so he had this extra air of authority over the table, which I always like. I think I might borrow. Anyway, but in terms of the decoration of the room and really throughout the house, broadly speaking, it is aestheticism. And I say broadly speaking because, of course, we can't really sort of pigeonhole Leighton in any one particular artistic category, because it was such an eclectic sort of array of influences at play in the house. And aestheticism really, what aestheticism was trying to do, and it's a very difficult word to say, so excuse me if I fall over it a few times, aestheticism was trying to make beauty the priority. So it's the idea of art for art's sake, and thus, with art for art's sake, art should become sort of unencumbered by history, politics, religion, any kind of didactic or moral role, that it literally just is art for itself, and is kind of free of the constraints of any what it's been used for in the past as a sort of vehicle for other disciplines. And so the way that we see this aestheticism manifest in here in particular, but is this lovely, or these wonderful stylized floral patterns we get in the architraves on the doorways and these gilded medallions. And indeed, these, as you can just see, a sort of close up here, so you get these wonderfully incised floriated patterns. And these continue throughout the house. So each room is so distinct, but because you have these wonderful patterns, it kind of stitches everything together a bit and creates something a bit more coherent. And this is another one of the many skills that Leighton had, as he was great at sort of making it all more consistent and tying together what could be visually quite overwhelming. Another aspect is this red flock wallpaper that we have. So this has this lovely velvety texture, and this was made up in Blackburn in Lancashire. And it was just more typical of exhibition spaces in that period, unlike the more sort of minimalist whitewash spaces that we're used to today. And then, of course, we have these wonderful Iznik ceramics hanging on the walls. And these are not the original Iznik ceramics that Leighton would have had. He would have had the 15th century original versions. But these are by a contemporary Iznik artist called Ismailit, who has revived this trade with great integrity to the original sort of biomorphic patterns that we see here, and the colours as well. In the early Iznik style, it tended to be a blend of blues, whites, turquoises, but as in the later Iznik style, they started to incorporate these reds and purples into the colour scheme as well. And but these are obviously sorry, it's just a detail of the lovely velvety wallpaper. But these ceramics are obviously hung in much the same way as they would have been in his day. And then I just want to talk a little bit about this vast ebonized sideboard. This is a relatively recent addition to the house in the last few years, and it's by a furniture designer called Luke Hughes. And it's a replica of a piece that Leighton and Aitchison designed for the house together. And they created various pieces of furniture because loosely in that sort of arts and crafts type philosophy, you would never just create the shell of a house and leave it at that. So they were very, well, obviously Leighton, but Aitchison as well, was very concerned with you would go right down to the details of the furniture, and the interiors would be coherent with the building, and the garden would wrap the house, so that it was a very holistic project, which may sound obvious, but there was a very sort of specific the way they went about it in this context. And you can see that Leighton's aestheticist details sit here alongside his neoclassical tendencies, with this kind of loosely sort of neoclassical type facade that the sideboard has. And these aestheticist details would have originally been completed in ivory, but for obvious reasons in this contemporary version have been done in fruit wood. And when you go to the house, you will be able to see these wonderful lapis lazuli bosses, which it's incredibly difficult to capture in a photograph, but they're the most exquisite colour, and really sort of light up the piece. Additionally, in the same way that Leighton would have had, we have these lovely blue and white nankeen ceramics, which serve to kind of break up what could otherwise be a sort of overwhelming piece that can kind of consume the room. So again, this is kind of Leighton's aesthetic eye at play. We just get a close-up of it there, and you can just about make out the lapis up here. So that's lapis from Afghanistan. And then I just want to talk about a couple of the paintings in the dining room. So this is, as it says, Michelangelo and his dying servant. So this was Leighton's sort of early to mid style of neoclassicism. And when I say neoclassicism, I mean typically focusing on mythological or historical subject matter. And in terms of the method, it was really sort of drawing on Greek and Roman sculpture for the forms and the shapes, essentially. So for the gestures, the postures, the draperies, the interactions, this sort of understated sense of heroism and the kind of allusions to components of classical architecture in the background. But also this very muted palette, which is in sharp contrast to what we'll see with his later work. So yes, this very muted palette, and then also with this quite distinct but very understated sense of pathos that we get with this slightly kind of Caravaggio chiaroscuro here with the light and shade, just kind of highlighting the emotive quality of this image. But by brilliant contrast, we have this one, which used to sit in the dining room. Well, we had it, it was on loan. Sadly, it has now left the house. But this is the beauty of a virtual talk, is that I can reintroduce things that aren't currently there. So we see a lovely contrast between his neoclassical, so 1860s, through to his aestheticist phase in painting, and this is really in his sort of early aestheticist phase. So this is 1881, Whispers, And so what he does is he starts to infuse the painting with some of the kind of high decoration of the house, essentially. He takes the same classical language or vocabulary, so it's the same shapes and forms, and he starts to stylize them ever so slightly so that they become something more sort of rhythmic and musical and sensuous, really. And even so that even the folds in the fabric start to become something more of a kind of decorative pattern than a kind of realistic depiction. I mean, obviously this is clearly still a figurative picture. There's nothing remotely abstract about it, but it's the very beginnings of something where he starts to sacrifice some of the realism for this sense of the decorative. And he starts to infuse it with these rich, warm, golden tones, which obviously just serve to exaggerate even further this enormously sort of luminous, decorative aesthetic that he's creating. And I think it's interesting to note that I'm just going to move on to the framed version, that the model for the female figure in this picture was Dorothy Dean, and Dorothy Dean was really his favorite model, and she appears in sort of 90% of his later paintings, certainly. And also she was really more than that. She was his sort of companion in life. We don't really know what the nature of their relationship was. There was obviously much speculation, but we do know that she was one of the most important people in his life. And I also should just note this frame here, which really became the sort of signature frame of Leighton's aestheticist period. And we can see why, because it's not at all understated. So we get this very flamboyant frame, which is made up again of, a little bit like with the sideboard, of the aestheticist designs and the stylized fluted pilaster designs down the side. And I don't know where this lovely squiggle has come from. Let's see if we can. Oh, okay. Sorry about this. We may have to delete the squiggle. Okay, well, we may have to put up with the squiggle for now. So we move now into the drawing room, and the drawing room is, again, I wanted to re-emphasize the notion of these aestheticist designs in the architraves and the doorways, so creating this thread of consistency throughout, and also the idea again of it being an exhibition space. So the colour on the walls here was described as a nut brown, or the colour of a good cigar. And this was specifically to set off his 4 favourite paintings, which were by the artist Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and show 4 different stages, there was a changing light in 4 different stages of the day. And these are not the originals. These are after Corot by an artist called Charlie Cobb. But we have here the originals, which are in the National Gallery. And I think the reason why Leighton was so sort of enamored with Corot was obviously for the sort of beautiful utopian ruralism that Corot was known for, and also this lovely sort of loose impasto use of paint that Corot was known for. But I think really it was because Corot was positioned on the sort of cusp of something quite traditional and something quite modern, which I think Leighton sort of identified with to a degree. So Corot retained certain neoclassical elements in his paintings, but he also at the same time anticipated through his kind of plein air style painting, so that's obviously just painting outside in the outdoors, he anticipated the Impressionists of several decades ahead. So he really was on this, as I say, on this sort of cusp of something quite innovative. And so this is another of my favourite pieces in the house, really. But this is on the north wall of the dining room, and it's sort of looking out onto the garden. And so it is a functioning fireplace. It often leaves people sort of scratching their heads a little bit as to quite what's going on here with this strange arrangement of the window positioned above the fireplace. It is so yes, it is a functioning fireplace. The flue travels to the left through the wall here, and but what I think is so interesting about this is that it's a brilliant example of the way that Leighton would take functional objects and he would somehow manage to turn them into works of art. So he had this ability, this eye, to see things in a different way and to create something really beautiful out of something that was ostensibly should just be quite straightforward and functional. And the other aspect is that it's a key part of the decoration is this this sort of tension or this interplay between understatement in the house and this sort of opulence and exuberance, and this sort of tension between these things. I think it's a kind of key aspect of the decoration. So we have this sort of relative understatement and restraint of the design and the fireplace, with the sort of grasses which he designed, and then we have the window above, which is pure art for art's sake. He wasn't going to let a chimney get in the way of his sort of artistic vision. No sort of boring practicalities were going to ruin this beautiful sense of proportion. But indeed, there is a mirrored panel that could come across the window at night. So this would just heighten it and make this aesthetic experience even more, would heighten it even further. And then just moving, so that's obviously just a detail of the lovely design that he created. So to move now onto the sort of centerpiece, really, of the whole house, which is this run of rooms from the Arab hall through to the staircase hall. And what he actually did was that the initial build of the house finished where these two columns are here with the acanthus leaf capitals. And so this staircase hall was based originally on a Venetian palatial courtyard, and a specific Venetian palace called Palazzo Centani. So it was the idea of a kind of grand staircase going round a wellhead was the concept that we are working with there. But about sort of 10 to 12 years later, through his travels, he'd accumulated this extraordinary collection of tiles, and he needed an effective way to display them. And so, no bathroom was quite going to do. So this is when he comes up with the concept of the Narcissus and the Arab halls that we see here. And so what he does is that he creates this sort of sense of consistency through the three spaces to create one space, so that we have this, well, primarily with this aestheticist color scheme of the peacock blue and the black and the gold that run throughout the three spaces, and also the use of this Roman style mosaic floor that runs throughout the three spaces as well, sort of creating this coherence once again. But at the same time, sort of maintaining the individual spaces as well. And I think the main inspiration for the kind of geometry and the decorative aspects and the kind of architectural aspects and much of the decoration in the Arab hall was based on this Sicilio-Norman palace called Palazzo l'Aziza, which was near Palermo in Sicily. And so we can see some similarities, obviously, not straightforwardly, between this courtyard in Palazzo l'Aziza and and what we see in the Arab hall, which is a photo taken from Leighton's day. However, there were also components, as certainly as once we reached the higher levels, there were also components of patterns and decorations that he'd seen at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which were incorporated into this. So just moving back to the Arab hall as it is as we see it today, the majority of the tiles in the Arab hall are 16th and 17th century Syrian tiles, and so obviously, once these were transported back, not all of them arrived intact, and some of them were fragments, and some panels had certain tiles missing. So this is when he employs the famous arts and crafts ceramicist William de Morgan to fill in any gaps, and to create any additional tiles. And indeed, William de Morgan was responsible for this fabulous turquoise blue that we see running throughout the rest of the house, and allegedly getting the recipe right for this colour nearly finished him off. But he did get there in the end, and it's an absolutely exquisite colour. I think what he did was he did things like starving the kiln of oxygen to create this really sort of iridescent effect that we see here. But to return back to the Arab Hall itself, so the parrots that we see sitting on the fountain, the bottom set of birds, this right-hand bird was the Syrian original, and the left-hand bird is William de Morgan's work. So you can just see the contrast between that original tile and the work that William de Morgan did. So slightly different colours and a slightly different style as well. And then these stunning tiles here are 17th century Persian tiles, and they are Kubachi. Kubachi tiles, and the influence here is mainly of the Iznik Ottoman, and also of illuminated manuscripts. That's what they're drawing on really for the shapes of the figures and the costumes and the draperies and the like. But these are really stunning. And then I'm going to move up to this mosaic frieze that runs around the upper section of the wall here. This was designed by the Victorian children's illustrator Walter Crane, and again drawing on patterns and designs that he'd seen at Palazzo L'Aziza. So it mainly consists of these sort of roundels with zodiac signs and various birds and peacocks indeed. And this was actually made up in Venice by a company called Salviati & Co, and then transported back and inserted into the hall. And then here, as we move up in the Arab Hall, we get these lovely kind of bell-shaped recesses in the corners here. And they are, well, in the Moorish architecture, they're called squinches or muqarnas, and they would have been part of the structural support for the dome or cupola above. But obviously here, they're not playing that role at all. Instead, Leighton has simply sort of deconstructed that concept, and he's just using it playfully in the decorative sense, and they're just sort of adding to the beauty of the thing. Again, this aestheticist priority of beauty, as opposed to their traditional role. And then we move up into the dome or cupola in this fabulous gilded or gold leaf dome, and these stained glass panels, which were taken from a mosque in Damascus. Only 2 of them made it back because they were so fragile. So only 2 made it back intact. The rest of them, obviously, Victorian copies of the originals. But part of the joy in this is that you can see with these stencil designs inside the cupola and also running around the rim here, in the 2008 restoration that took place, these were sort of revealed, having not been apparent before. They've been sort of covered up by a century of sort of muck and dirt and paint. So this was an astonishing discovery, and just sort of adds even more kind of exquisite decoration to this already extraordinary construction. And so now I just want to sort of focus up here on this brass and copper gaselier. So what we have here is with these stylized brass birds that are kind of attached to this copper ring. And again, this is really a sort of Victorian pastiche of a kind of gaselier or chandelier that would have been found in a mosque, typically in Syria. And then this panel at the back here is a text taken from it's a panel that was thought to have been originally from Pakistan, but is now thought to be Syrian as well. And it's the creation text from the Quran. And it's one panel that is thought to be a sort of authentic piece, as opposed to some of the other script panels, which are have inaccurate scripts and were clearly created for commercial purposes. And so this is one of the kind of authentic pieces that was probably taken from a mosque or a palace. And then just to mention this wonderful structure up here, this is a zanana or mashrabiyah, and it's would have been used for the segregation of men and women in both secular and religious contexts. And this one here, sorry, we will get a better view of it, particularly when we go upstairs, when you can get a much better aspect from the other side. But this probably would have been used on the first floor of a house in Cairo, so that women could look down onto the street without revealing themselves, but also just for sort of practical ventilation purposes. It just is another brilliant example of Leighton and his extraordinary sort of innovative, creative way of taking certain things and turning them into something completely other and extraordinary. And certainly adds value to this particular hall. And then I'm just going to move through, and then, sorry, yes, we have another view here of the zanana from beneath. So we get this lovely box structure from underneath. Through to the staircase hall. So as I mentioned earlier, the staircase hall, the design here was based on this Venetian palace, Palazzo Centani, and with this grand staircase going round this sort of wellhead structure here. And but so nothing was altered structurally with the addition of the Narcissus Hall and the Arab Hall. Instead, it was just the color schemes, as we mentioned, with the peacock blue and the black and the gold. But there were certain other kind of details added at this point, and indeed we get these wonderful, if you can just about make out these gilded stencil designs in the soffit or the underside of the staircase here, which is so typical of Leighton to have this degree of attention to detail to work on decorating the underside of one staircase, but also it ties in with the gilded medallions in the ebonized wood on the staircase there, and also with certain motifs that we see in the mosaic floor as well. So once again, creating this sort of sense of continuity and consistency, and making it sort of less visually overwhelming than it might be. And then I just want to talk about this magnificent piece here. So this is a Turkish 17th century wedding chest with these two Satsuma vases from the Satsuma region in Japan sitting beneath it. These are not part of Leighton's original collection. He had something very similar, but these are a sort of a relatively recent addition to the house. So the chest, just to get a sort of closer look at it, was typical of Leighton's love of this wood marquetry and ivory inlay in this incredibly intricate way, and we get this lovely stylized mukana design running along the bottom here as well. But Leighton, being a lifelong bachelor, didn't have much use for a wedding chest. So being this great creative that he turns it instead into a seat. So this is what we have on the first flight of stairs. And indeed, the designs for the embroidery on the textiles was completed by the garden designer and artist Gertrude Jekyll. So there were so many different sort of eyes and minds at play here, that even though, you know, later on obviously was the sort of curator of it all, but it was very much a sort of collaborative effort with all these artists contemporary to his to the time. So it really is an exquisite sort of demonstration of that. That's just a close up, obviously, of the embroidery. And then opposite the seat, we have this this panel of Iznik tiles on the first flight of stairs. And what's interesting about these, apart from their obvious beauty, is that we've looked obviously, I referenced the Iznik ceramics in the dining room, but these are the original Iznik ceramics. So these are from the 15th century. And just also interesting or important to make the distinction between these, which are the Turkish Ottoman, as opposed to the Syrian tiles, the Syrian Ottoman ones that we've been looking at in the Arab Hall. And this is the sort of principal style, really. It was slightly earlier and influenced the Syrian style, and was typically more used therefore in mosques and palaces and the like, because it was slightly more refined. The colors didn't bleed into each other so much. The definition was that much clearer. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's this idea of these blues and whites and turquoises in these in the early style, and maybe with this later panel introducing the reds and purples that were typical to the later Iznik style. And then here, this lovely portrait is positioned on the third flight of stairs. And it is by, it's a portrait of Leighton, and it is by his good friend George Frederic Watts. And Watts was one of the reasons that he moved to this area in Holland Park. Watts was living with another artistic family called the Princeps in Little Holland House. And it was really the only extant house on the estate at that time, bar obviously the main Holland house. And the Holland family were having financial difficulties, so they were selling off plots of land, and this is when Leighton bought his plot. So really the only, like as I said, the only extant buildings at the time were Little Holland House and the old dairy next door in the kind of within the estate. So it must have been relatively rural in appearance at that time. But Leighton really sort of led the way, certainly with this style of studio house. So there were many different styles of studio houses built over the next couple of decades, and indeed I think by 1900 there were at least 21 artists living in the sort of immediate vicinity, so it became really a sort of artist hub following Leighton's establishing himself there. And then we just return to the plan again. So obviously we're coming up the stairs here and into the studio. And so here is the studio, which was really for Leighton the most important room in the house. And because it was not only obviously was it the room he spent most of his time in, but it was used for many different purposes and roles. So he would use it for exhibitions, and he would use it for his concerts, particularly for his annual music that obviously happened every year. And he had all the great musicians of the day playing on the stage here. He was also a very capable musician and singer as well. So he would join in on this. He also had these things called at-homes on a Sunday afternoon between 3 and 5 p.m. when the public could come round the house. So there was this sort of constant flood of activity within the house, or certainly within this room particularly. He would also actually incidentally hold the private view for his submission of paintings to the summer exhibition at the RA each year, obviously in this room, and that would be for various members of the royal family, and he would set up his submission of 6 paintings that were to go in each year. But just to talk about a little bit about the structure of the room, it was the first room that he extended by 4.5 meters in this direction. And that was so that he could incorporate this balcony. And the balcony meant that the models who came up from a separate entrance could come and change behind the screen here before coming to pose on the podium beneath the window on the north side here. And it also meant that Leighton could work on his larger canvases from the top of the balcony here, because certainly in his sort of early to mid period of painting, he was working on huge scale. And indeed, this here is the canvas door. And so the canvases would be hauled up from the outside into the studio through this door. So that again indicates the scale that he was working on. This, of course, became redundant with the building of the Arab Hall, which was below that. But he was really starting to work on a rather smaller scale by that point anyway. And then up here we have a plaster copy of a section of the Parthenon frieze, which of course is very useful if one is working in the neoclassical style, so he could observe all the sort of shapes and forms and gestures and postures and draperies and the like, and incorporate those into his paintings. And then this, I'm just jumping outside for a second, because I wanted to give, we didn't have a kind of a photo that really gave a proper view of this vast north window. So instead we're looking at it from the garden here. Just so that you can see the extent of it. And it was a very significant part of the studio because a north-facing window provided the most consistent light for an artist throughout the day. So this was a key aspect, and it would flood the studio with light, as it still does today. And then I just want to obviously talk about a couple of the paintings in here. So this is the Death of Brunelleschi, painted in 1852 when he was just 22. So it was really his sort of graduate piece, and it was a sort of virtuoso piece of look, these are my skills, this is what I can do. So we see him playing with the garland of flowers, and his skills in depicting the sort of sumptuousness of these silks and fabrics, and the pallor of the dying Brunelleschi, who doesn't look in great shape, and then the grisaille technique of this, depicting the relief details in the architecture. But really, the kind of the sort of most intriguing part of this picture, obviously, is this slightly fantastical scene going back to Brunelleschi's Duomo in the distance there. This is not a scene I don't think any of us would be able to find, as it's very much a sort of degree of artistic license going on there, I think. But aside from the fact that you could spend a week just observing the extraordinary extent of detail in this scene, I think what's most wonderful is that Leighton was actually awarded by the Royal Institute of British Architects a gold medal based on the fact that that he would have made a very good architect, and they determined this by looking at the sort of incredibly accurate rendering of buildings that he produced in his paintings, and therefore decided that he was really sort of in the wrong job. But that was a great claim, that the depictions of his buildings were so extraordinarily precise and accurate that they revealed a profound architectural knowledge. And he did have had a great love of architecture, so it's no great coincidence. And then on the opposite wall, we have Clytie. Clytie was Leighton's final painting, still on the easel when he died in 1896. And much has been made of this in terms of speculation as to whether it was unfinished because of this sort of rough area of paint in this top right corner here, and also whether it was reflecting to some extent his state of mind in anticipation of his imminent death. But really, I think this sort of discussion kind of overshadows the essence of the painting itself, which depicts this tale from Ovid's Metamorphoses of Clytie, the nymph, who was left to watch her unrequited love, the sun god Helios, later known as Apollo, fly across the sky every day for 9 days. And so in her sort of weariness and frustration and desperation, she becomes rooted into the ground, and ultimately transforms into either a heliotrope or a sunflower, depending on which version of the story you go with. And obviously this gets once again the aestheticist treatment that we saw with Whispers, the painting in the dining room. So he takes the same traditional classical forms with the Ionic fluted column and this classically draped female form, but he starts to twist and contort them and stylize them essentially so that they become something more something more decorative and rhythmic and musical and sensuous and sinuous, and something that evokes a mood and a feeling. So the narrative is condensed down really into this moment more of a sense of a sort of sensation of longing and yearning. And it's really very powerful. But I think really probably more of the emphasis in this painting is for Leighton, certainly, I think, was this fascination with light and with almost, I suppose, the decorative capacity of this luminous quality of light that he started to incorporate in his paintings. And the precedent for this was the sketches, the numerous oil sketches and exquisite oil sketches that he produced on his travels. So what he would do is he would produce, and I'm sorry about this, but this pencil sketch here is very faint, but it's the only one that sort of it indicates the point, which is what he used to do, which it was to produce a very rapid sketch on plein air in whichever environment he was in or landscape he was in. He would produce this rapid pencil sketch and sort of etch out the forms and the shapes, and then he would annotate it. We can just see this line with the sort of annotations with all the colors that he encountered in this skyscape, and then he would convert all of this information into these little oil sketches that he would complete as he traveled. And for Leighton, these were really just for his own enjoyment and relaxation. They weren't obviously for any kind of commercial purpose, and I don't think they were even really considered studies as such, or not studies in preparation for a painting. But of course they would have informed his later works, and certainly the more he did of these, particularly when he was in the Mediterranean, because obviously these sketches, particularly this one up here, is actually in Donegal in Ireland, but the sketches were from all over the place, from Scotland to Cornwall to Cairo to Damascus to Italy. But the sort of the more that he did of these, of course, the greater impact they had on his painting, and this fascination with this decorative, luminous quality of light. But as I say, they were really more just for his own entertainment and his relaxation. I think he referred to them as reminiscences or suggestions. And for me, I mean, this is obviously very subjective, but I think the fact that they were produced in this very informal way, unlike the kind of very labored process that could happen with some of his more finished paintings, means that he produced something that is so sort of palpable in its description and its sort of evocation of the environment that he's in. You get almost a sense of the kind of the temperature of the place, the feel of it, the air, the texture of the landscape. It is really just is so evocative, and there are these little mini oil sketches scattered all over the house, so they really are worth going and scrutinizing, because I think they are just a sort of so compelling, really, in a completely different way to his finished works. And then I just want to talk about some of his sculpture. So Leighton was really the pioneer of a movement called New Sculpture, and because it was considered, really quite radical at the times. Obviously, that doesn't look that to our eyes now when we look at this sculpture. So this is an athlete wrestling a python, and so what he did is he took the traditional classical form and the sort of idealized muscular form, but he added in these sort of bulging veins, so that there was this really kind of palpable, again, sense of the strain and the stress of the body in this struggle against the python. And in addition to this, there's no kind of one obvious perspective from which to view this sculpture. So it very much encouraged the viewer to move around the sculpture, again, adding to this sense of sort of dynamism and vitality and energy to the sculpture. So he really sort of brought these classical forms to life in a way that for the late Victorian period was considered really quite radical, as I said. And then we move into the silk room. And the silkroom was, well, this is the silkroom and this is the antechamber formerly. But this was the last addition to the house in 1894, just 2 years before he died. And so, as you know, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this really was this sort of work in progress throughout his life. And again, we see the stylized floral patterns in the architraves on the doorways here, and the gilded medallions. So still keeping that kind of consistency and that sort of thread of consistency throughout the house. And the color on the walls was described as a damp leaf green, which I think is true, in this lovely silk. And this the silkroom was created specifically as a picture gallery for pictures typically that he'd received from friends, or purchases he'd made from fellow artist friends. And so, and then we have these lovely sort of lantern lights that flood the room with light as well. And then I'm just going to move around the corner here to so this obviously is the other side of the mashrabiyah, or the zanana, that I referenced in the Arab hall. So we get this the other side of this lovely lattice box structure, and in this, positioned in this sort of niche in the corner of the silkroom, it gives a wonderful aspect onto certain bits of decoration in the Arab hall, which we might otherwise have missed, because there's only a certain amount that you can glean from below before your neck becomes weary. But this just gives another a sort of extraordinary perspective onto the extent of the decoration that we see there. And obviously he's used some of the leftover, really, Syrian tiles from the Arab hall to decorate the sides of this niche. You can see that some of the patterns here, certainly on the right, aren't completely coherent. So it's just the sort of odds and ends that have been used up in this context. And then in the foreground here is another of his sculptures, and this is Needless Alarms. And again, working in the neoclassical style, this was and adding this sense of sort of vitality and life and surprise to it. Has a certain lightness to it, this sculpture, and it is called Needless Alarms because it is a naked girl being scared by a frog, as so often happens. And he actually gave a cast of this to his good friend John Everett Millais, in exchange for Millet's painting that is situated on the other wall of the silkroom, called Shelling Peas. And Millet was obviously known really as being one of the protagonists of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood that was formed in 1848. And their mission was to return some integrity to art. They felt that since the Renaissance, art had lacked integrity and had become frivolous and sort of pointless. They referred to Sir Joshua Reynolds as Sir Sloshua. And so they wanted to return to kind of medieval values in terms of subject matter and in terms of craft. So they were focused on literary and religious subject matter, and they wanted to create paintings that had rich colours and complex compositions, and close attention to nature. But it was a relatively short-lived movement because it wasn't really particularly lucrative, I suppose, more than anything. And Millet was quite savvy and possibly a little hypocritical, because he moved towards the end of his life towards this really almost quite impressionist style, of which I think he realized was more commercial, that people preferred in the late Victorian period to have pictures of pretty girls shelling peas on their walls than they did to have sort of intense religious didactic works moralizing them. And then we move, this is just in the corner of the silkroom to the left of the shelling peas picture. And this is a very charming study for the snappily named Cimabue's celebrated Madonna is carried in procession through the streets of Florence. And so this is a scene taken from Vasari's Lives of the Artists. And I really mention it because it's a really charming painting, and and also is a lovely example of Leighton's earlier, perhaps, a style that was more sort of medieval in its influence, before he progressed to his neoclassical and then obviously finally aestheticist. But the final painting, which we see here, was his first major sale to Queen Victoria, no less. And I believe that, or allegedly, Queen Victoria wrote in her diary that day that we saw a wonderfully colourful painting by a man called Frederic Leighton today, and Albert said, I absolutely must buy it. So she did. And that was the story behind that one. But I think actually, again, obviously, again, this is very subjective, but studies can often have so much more sort of life and vitality to them. Just to go back to the study here, you get this sense of lightness and movement, and I just think they're often more revealing of what it is the artist is actually trying to achieve, than the kind of more formal, finished, perhaps more static version that you might get in the final painting. And then so to reference now this beautiful painting here, which was another of Leighton's favourite artists. So this is Jacopo Tintoreto, and it's a portrait of a Venetian nobleman. And we can see why he was another of Leighton's kind of favourite artists, because the sophistication in the rendering, this very subtle distinction between the silk of the sleeve and that wisp of lace cuff, and the arm of the chair here, and the fur of the stole, and then the sort of wisps of the beard, and this face, the flesh that's so palpable, that you just absolutely see the life in this very distinguished face, and it's a painting that is really made up of so few colors, but the details are so specifically described, and obviously these deep, dark, rich oils that were so typical of the Venetian, or the Venetian High Renaissance, were very influential on Leighton's early to mid neoclassical style of painting. And then I just want to mention this here, which is by Rossellino, who's a 14th century Sienese artist, and it's the Madonna of the Candelabra. And I really just reference this because it's an example again of the kind of diversity of mediums and styles that Leighton was absorbing and had in his collection. This was a key part of his collection. And so it's a painted terracotta Madonna and Child, and just adds a lovely kind of diversity, I suppose, to the oil paintings that we see in the rest of the room. And so finally, we reach the bedroom, and the only bedroom, except for there was a small bedroom in the attic with 2 beds in it for the maids. And for me, the bedroom is sort of wonderfully revealing in its contrast to the rest of the house. Leighton had a very strong public presence. He, as we discussed when we were in the dining room, he was this very kind of gregarious, charismatic man, but he was also known for being quite aloof. And certainly no one really knew anything about his private life, or quite rightly, but and he left no private diaries or journals of any kind. So there's really very little that we know about his private life, in contrast to the amount of sort of formal correspondence and the like that we know that has been left, reflecting his public life. But it seems that therefore what we can glean is from the way that he went about his house, that we can see to some degree some sense of the man himself. So this very bold, opulent public persona that we see in the rest of the house, and then we get this in this one private space that he has. The contrast is extraordinary, that we get this sort of almost monastic quality in this room. Everything is incredibly pared down. There's none of the decoration in the architraves on the doorways. It's a relatively kind of understated William Morris India pattern wallpaper on the walls. and this very simple brass bed, and the use that was quite typical of that time of black and white prints of various well-known, typically sort of Renaissance paintings on the walls. So I think we get, or certainly I always get the sense of this kind of this this tension, or this kind of interplay between this sort of this restraint and modesty in his life and in his style and his artistic life, and this kind of more extravagant sort of image that he put out to the rest of the world, or to certainly his reputation in the art world. And then just to point out a few other details, this here is a portrait of his younger sister, Alexandra, on the wall there. And then on the opposite wall, currently in the house, there is a print of his most famous painting, which is Flaming June. And it is a print because, of course, this painting, Flaming June, actually resides in Puerto Rico. And so this is a photo taken from when it came back here for an exhibition a few years ago. And Flaming June is really the sort of apex, if you like, of what I've been discussing in terms of his aestheticist painting, where he started to sacrifice some of the sense of realism for this sense of the decorative. And we can see that it's really exaggerated here with the length of this thigh. If she stood up, she would be, well, a giant. And also the way that the fabric falls is not realistic. It is purely decorative. So he's creating decorative patterns here. So once again, this painting is obviously figurative. There's nothing essentially abstract about it, but it's really moving towards something that sort of is giving an indication of something more abstract. And indeed, when we had this painting in the exhibition, there were some beautiful preparatory sketches for Flaming June as part of the exhibition, and what those sort of turned into in the kind of series of sketches was ultimately a kind of rhythmic circle of a decorative pattern that he was creating in something almost like a sort of abstract unconscious of the painting, if you like. And it was a kind of exquisite insight into the mechanics of what he was doing here, which was to create this really just beautiful, decorative, evocative image, which was again infused with this this extraordinary luminous light that we discussed with Clytie. Yes, it's just an extraordinary piece. If you ever have the opportunity to see this painting, I would recommend it. It's particularly in the winter because it literally it's like a light box. It's it lights. It's absolutely mesmerizing and compelling. But that brings us to the end of this talk, and I hope I've provided you with some useful information and insights into the house, so that when it reopens, you'll be able to visit and see some of these things in the flesh, so to speak. But thank you very much for listening. And I think we are going to move to some questions now, if there are any.
Yes, thank you so much, Imogen. That was fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us. And yes, if you have any questions, feel free to grab them on the chat box and I will read them out to Imogen. Imogen, at the moment everyone they're saying thank you so much. They're all really excited about the talk, and we have people joining from all over the world, and so that's really exciting.
Wonderful. How brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, I just wish I could actually see everyone. It's always a confusing thing on Zoom, isn't it, of not of not being able to see people's faces properly when you're talking to them, unlike when I'm talking in the house.
We have a question, Imogen.
Yeah.
Someone is asking whether there was a kitchen in the house.
Yes, I mean the kitchens were all downstairs in the basement. So there was a kitchen and a sort of butler's pantry, and it's no longer the case because they've been turned into sort of staff rooms and the like, sadly. So they're not part of what one can view as the house, but that's where the kitchens were based.
Thank you. Yeah, again, lovely comments. Everyone has enjoyed the presentation. Yes, many people are asking about the recording, and yes, this talk has been recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week, probably. So I'll be circulating an email to everyone with the right link for you to see the recording and to share as well. There was a question about Flaming June. Yeah. Who was the model for this?
Dorothy Dean again. At least she was the model for certain parts of it, because that was the way they tended to work with models in those days. They would use someone's face, perhaps someone else's hand, and someone else's leg often, which was a slightly curious way to do things, but that seemed to be the way they practiced. But certainly she was the kind of main model in Flaming June.
Thank you. Maybe we can go through two more questions. There's one about the Morgan tiles. Gladys is asking, when the Morgan made tiles to replace those that were missing, did he have the originals as templates?
Yes, he would have had the tiles to work from, because they would have already been stored in he would have had them back in London at that point. So yes, De Morgan would have been working with the originals when he was creating replicas or repairing tiles. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this could be a nice last question. Someone is asking, where did he get the money to do and to buy all these lovely things and to build such a lovely house?
It's a very good question. He was very lucky in that he inherited a lot of money, because his grandfather had been a physician to the Tsars in Russia and had amassed a considerable fortune there, which is really what enabled him to live this artistic life. He also earned a lot of money in his own right. He became, after the sale to Queen Victoria, obviously he got the right kind of rather sort of lucrative clientele, so that was a helpful move. He did make his own money, but what allowed him to embark on this career was the inheritance from his grandfather.
Thank you. Yes, I think, are you okay to answer just one more?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So Odette is asking whether Leighton leaving the house while the builders extended the house and doing all these building works.
He was traveling. If things were being done, he tended to travel. He would always travel for several weeks a year. But in that instance, he might have extended that to months. And I mean, if he needed to come back to London, I'm sure he would have stayed with friends in the area, of which he had many. Does that answer it?
Great. I think that's all from me in terms of questions, Imogen.
Great. I just wanted to apologise for I don't know where the strange lines came from that appeared in the middle of the presentation at one point. I'm not sure what happened there, but apologies for the obscuring or that the pictures were obscured for a time. I don't know if that was on everyone's screens, but anyway, thank you again.